Welcome to the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast with me, Susie Vidori, where I peel back the layers of how to wow your readers with your fiction, your nonfiction. Anybody can bang out a first draft, but it takes a little more work to make your book as amazing as it can be. Join me as I share the step-by-step writing techniques you could apply to your writing right away, as I host successful writers who share a behind-the-scenes look at their own writing lives, and as I live coach writers on their pages, giving practical writing examples that will make your own writing stronger. Nobody is born knowing how to write an engaging book. There are real and important skills that you need to learn. On this show, I cut through the noise and get you all the info you need. I can't wait to see how this information is going to transform your writing. This week, we have such a special episode, and I can't wait for you to hear it. On the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast, we get pitches every single week from writers who'd like to come on the show, and that's amazing. Keep sending them, but we're picky. We want to pick and we want to highlight writers who are doing really cool things and who are doing in-depth things and who are going to share their stories with our listeners. You, the listeners, that's why you keep listening. But when this pitch came across my desk to have Dr. Sean Pazowski on the podcast, I lit up like a Christmas tree, because if you've been following this podcast for a while, you know that I like to dabble in a little bit of brain science and have these conversations, and that I'm absolutely obsessed with how readers process information and how they take what we write and they experience it and they experience our stories. And so Dr. Sean Pazowski is actually a neurologist, and he has written his debut novel, Stage of Fools. And it is my absolute pleasure. And I was like, okay, we can come on. We're going to talk about this whole process. And I just am really excited because his studying of the human brain has given him such an advantage for writing. And it's one that I want you all to have as well. So welcome my guest, Dr. Sean Pazowski. He's a practicing hospital neurologist in the University of Colorado system, where he conducts clinical research employing neurotechnology primarily for the optimization of epilepsy management. He's the medical director of the Neuroscience Foundation. He's an active member of the American Academy of Neurology and the American Medical Association, and his research experience includes time at the National Institute of Mental Health, the Energy and Commerce Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Kauffman Foundation for Entrepreneurship. His literary scholarship has been presented at the International Nabokov Society Conference in Montreux, Switzerland, and elsewhere. Stage of Fools is his debut novel. I don't know how he got it done. We're going to ask him that here with all of the other things that he's doing. Pull up your favorite mug of tea or coffee or your favorite beverage and enjoy. Welcome to the show, Dr. Sean Pazowski. So excited to have him here today. His novel, Stage of Fools, came out in October of 2025, and we are here today to talk all about it. Welcome to the show, Sean.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I just have to ask, you're doing all these things. You've got short stories. You're a doctor, a medical doctor. Why did you write Stage of Fools, this particular book, at this particular moment in your life? What was behind that?
Yeah, so there's a long story and kind of an abbreviated version, so I'll kind of just try to provide some context. So you're right, guilty. I went to medical school, became a practicing neurologist, but I was also a literature major in college. And so I'd always planned to write, and I had this great mentor who really instilled in me that, you can sort of have a broader worldview, provided that, I think the way he put it was, you can write, but be sure you get a day job. So I don't know why I chose something that takes 15 years to become a quote day job, but there was also a lot of mentorship there when it came to science. And he was a lab tech in a molecular biology lab studying immunology at the same time that he was Vladimir Nabokov's assistant at Cornell. And so, it's maybe not the most traditional path, but I decided to just go for it and go to medical school. And so obviously that took a while. I didn't really have a lot of time for writing, but about 10 years ago, I started to get more serious about it. Wrote my first novel, which is actually the prequel, kind of similar to your Fountain series. This is the initial one is the centerpiece. And so, but to really get into why, this novel, why now? And I've written about 9 manuscripts at this point. So I've kind of been,
My goodness.
working away But about 4 years ago, I became curious about this new emerging field of neurotechnology. There's another long story about that, but kind of suffice it to say, over the last 10 years, neurotechnology has just kind of become a new focus, not only in terms of clinical, but broader application. And so I was very curious about this, and I just learned about a few interesting items within the neurotech space and the space of neurology. So I combine things and put those two things together to create Stage of Fools.
Oh my goodness. There's so much to unpack there. 9 manuscripts that you finished, but none of them are published yet, right? Just this one? Is that right?
Uh,
Or was the
yeah, this is
prequel already published?
the prequel's not published yet. Yeah. So this is the first long form fiction that I published.
Oh my goodness. And 9 manuscripts. And sometimes it takes that long to finish them and to get it right. And wow, you're going to have a long, prolific writing career ahead of you as well. I love that you have all these different facets and that somebody told you to get a day job, because that's very similar to my own story where I was told, I wasn't told writing couldn't be a job. I just never was told it could be. And so I went into banking and technology for 20 years and then manufacturing later. And I thought I would write on the side. So I'll be really interested to follow your career and see what happens. For me, after I wrote the second book, I really didn't have time to be an executive anymore. There was too many things taking over. And people will often say I actually was interviewed on a news channel a few weeks back when I was at a conference, and the actual interviewer said to me, "Oh, well, that I guess you make a lot less money now." Like it's just this misperception necessarily. It depends what you do, right? It depends what you do. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I tend to think that we try to silo ourselves into different areas, and but life is too complicated. And if you've got a creative interest, I think anybody should pursue that. So kudos for your journey as well.
Hey, definitely. It was not, if you'd have told me I'd be doing this 10 years ago, I would have thought you were nuts, but I couldn't be more pleased. Okay, so because of your literary background, I love all of these facets. So because of your literary background, when you wrote this book, you call it a genre called science-informed literary fiction. Can you talk a little bit about that genre and what does it mean to you and why is it important not necessarily to be, I mean, it is science fiction, sort of, but what's the distinction for you in those different terms?
We could obviously spend a long time talking about genre and unpacking that. And there, people probably more equipped to do that who are deeply embedded in, what is
Yeah,
sci-fi, what is,
we won't hold
what,
you to it, but why did you choose science-informed literary fiction? What does that mean to you?
yeah. So what it means to me is that I care. I think it's kind of how you weight what's driving the manuscript and the story. So I tend to view science fiction as kind of starting with a scientific concept and then sort of being built around that, where the characters,
Mhm.
have their own inner lives and have their own emotional, processes and interactions. But it's everything's kind of tied to, okay, thinking of an example like Jurassic Park, where it's like genetic technology, we've created these dinosaurs, and the characters are just kind of living in that world. And that's great. And I love that. And Jurassic Park's one of my favorite books and franchises. And, a long time ago, my dad used to tell me, like, you should try to be like Michael Crichton, so big kudos to that. But I think I tend, just in my own literary journey and because of the influence of my mentor named Steve Parker, that I really want the literary aspects to shine, the kind of interiority, the kind of character development, the internal processes of the characters, and really to put that kind of, if you had to weight it, it might be 51-49 with the science, as far as like a percentage, but, or maybe 60-40. But I really want readers to come away with a sense of the literary, aspects of the character development and the plot, and that the science should serve that as opposed to vice versa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it was a really smart choice for this book because you chose a difficult structure, right? If you were going straight science fiction, we're looking for a little bit more plot driven. And your main character is in a coma. And so, we don't have the interiority is real. And you've chosen a structure with a coma and a braided timeline with the past and present. So what challenges did this structure pose for you as you wrote?
I was a little hesitant, to go down this path. And so maybe just to unpack that a little bit further about the coma,
Yeah.
sort of the inspiration. So about 10 years ago, we named a condition that was discovered. I think it was named 20 years ago. or it was mentioned 20 years ago, but things sort of got its scientific name 10 years ago. And that condition is called cognitive motor dissociation. And what that means, we've got a lot of syllables in medicine, but basically all that means is that a person who is in a comatose state is able to sense and to hear and be sentient at the same time that they are unable to respond to the world around them. And there's a lot of complex neurology that goes into that. But it was such a surprise when we discovered, that this was a real thing. So that intrigued me, both from my personal experience as an early career neurologist. I got consulted a lot about patients in comas and people asking, what's going on, what's going to happen. And I found that to be a very challenging, interesting and challenging, question. And so I came across this cognitive motor dissociation, and then, that's kind of the scientific backing. But to your question about, how to write a novel in that context, I think the first thing I thought was like, well, how is there going to be any action? Like, how is there going to be any tension? How is there going to be a plot? All those things. So what I did is, I knew I wanted to tell kind of classic story in a modern way. And so I chose the plot of King Lear to kind of lean on as sort of what's happening around this, somewhat elderly character, 70-year-old character, kind of listening. And so the novel is very much informed by King Lear and kind of very much tracks it throughout, most of it. It doesn't quite, but get to the end. But so that was the reasoning behind, how to keep the action and tension flowing. And then to braid it with a murder mystery, I thought that would be a good way to sort of keep attention and also bring in other themes, kind of big picture themes that would keep the action going. So that was the challenge. And that's how I chose to try to tackle it.
Yeah, it was really smart because I think I like to say, if you have these dual timelines, you have the past and present, you nailed it here. It's really difficult, especially in the past timeline, to create any tension because, the guy ends up in a coma, right? So if we're going into his own memories and his own life, we kind of know where it ends. And so it is difficult to set that up. There's no surprise factor. There's no tension because we know not everything is going to be fine in this case, but we know where he's going to end up. But it can be used to inform what happens in the present, right? So it can be used to inform the decisions or what's going on. So yeah, really cool. I also saw in some of your writings that you were talking about using a sensory detail to set off a memory. And so as you're sort of flipping between these past and present timelines, using something that's happening or something that your main character, Steve, is thinking about can set off those flashbacks or those actual memories which are in your past timeline. And how do you think, is that really what happens in real life? Because that's what we do in writing, for sure. Is that what happens in real life? Is that how memories are triggered?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is to an extent, absolutely. I think probably the most famous example of that would be the Madeleine cookie in Proust's In Search of Lost Time, where he's eating this Madeleine cookie, and that sets off this whole orchestra of memory. And so it doesn't quite, get to that point in Stage of Fools, but I think it is very powerful. And just to maybe expand on that Madeleine cookie, we know that the olfactory or the smell pathways are deeply linked to taste and vice versa. I think that's, pretty much common knowledge at this point. But what may not always be clear is that those pathways run directly to the memory centers in the brain. So there's a structure called the hippocampus, which I think a lot of people have heard of or kind of, familiar with. And it's sort of like the crossroads of memory, like there's a big loop of structures and it all runs through the hippocampus. And so just, to your question, memory does kind of get triggered in ways by sensory perception, very powerfully by smell and taste, but also by visuals and just kind of, everybody's kind of built differently. But that'd be one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So in the book, how much is science? How much is fiction? How did you balance that?
That's also, I think, a choice that we have to kind of make. I mean, I think that, to your point about like a lot of writers have day jobs and we all kind of live in, what is a profession? What is a job? It involves a lot of jargon. And I think medicine is guilty probably more than most about the complexity of the word, and it can get very esoteric very quickly. And so I tried to kind of shy away from that, because I think that kind of comes from my experience, talking to patients. If I walk into a room, I'm not going to be saying the cerebral cortex, I'm going to say your brain. Or if I'm going to talk about, the kidney, I'm not going to say the renal architecture, I'm going to say the kidney, to kind of keep it simple. And I think that was a choice. I mean, I'm not saying like, if you need to describe a complex topic, use a complex word if you need to. But I would say that, I tried to make it balanced so that the science is definitely there. And maybe if you feel like, this is esoteric, that the book leads you to a deeper understanding. If you already have kind of a scientific background and already have a deeper understanding, that it's not too general or too simple. But I tried not to use sort of like the hospital speak throughout the entirety.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So because we're talking about these general, these very difficult terms and whatnot, I'm going to dive in and try to pronounce something that I read about this book. And so the main technology that you introduce here, the fictional main technology, is the ultrasonic thalamic stimulation. Is that right? So,
Yeah.
so how did you come up with that? So that's not real, right?
Yeah. So I think it's also kind of one of those yes, but not quite.
Okay.
And yeah, so ultrasonic thalamic stimulation is an experimental concept for a treatment. I think it was got some publicity about 10 years ago at UCLA. They were actually able to help people wake up out of comas, basically by introducing sound waves into a structure deep in the brain, kind of olive-shaped structure that we call the thalamus, which is actually kind of coming more into the consciousness of the neurologic community as sort of a relay center for consciousness. And so until I had that sort of second part to the cognitive motor dissociation, like there really wasn't much of a novel, but I wanted to introduce that. And just to be very clear, ultrasonic thalamic stimulation is not something you could go and ask for today, but as part of the overarching kind of pathos and kind of zeitgeist we're entering with neurotechnology, I wanted to show something that was experimental and had promise because, everything that we take for granted today as being common, standard of practice was at one point experimental. And so I wanted to show that. And yeah, so the thalamus, very interesting structure, and it's getting a lot more attention in terms of not only consciousness, but sort of the subconscious and how that might be, kind of triggers for memory that kind of bubble up through different sensory pathways, of which the thalamus is a very important one. You're involved in a very important one.
I love that you say that everything that we know today is standard was once experimental. And the same is true with some of the anecdotal evidence that you see in your daily practice, but you can't prove yet, right? And I think it was one of the reasons that you cited for wanting to do a fictional novel at this time. It's because we can use that anecdotal evidence. We can't necessarily write a research paper yet, but we can explore the what ifs and being in there. And I think one of the examples that you used was coma patients responding to loved ones, right? They seem to,
Mhm.
but we're not sure yet. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that in my anecdotal experience, I have seen people who have shown signs of more attentiveness, more alertness, more response when it's a loved one in the room. And that could just take the form of like a heart rate increase. It could take the form in breathing, kind of subtle signs in the consciousness. We've kind of become obsessed these days in medicine with measuring things with numbers and tests, and we should absolutely do that and try to do all the data-driven analysis. But there are things that go beyond that, which is why I thought a narrative approach to really this neurotechnology revolution that's about to happen was important because, as we know, I think intuitively as writers, it doesn't take much explaining to us that life is story and, everything is story on a personal level, but you also need the bigger narratives kind of capture. And so that's what I was hoping for Stage of Fools to kind of add to that broader narrative about neurotechnology. This is real stuff and it's going to change the world, and it already is, but it's going to take some conversation. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, this anecdotal hope that coma patients could be able to respond to loved ones, that's not new in fiction, right? Like it's still new because we haven't been able to prove it in science. But I mean, I'm thinking of soap operas and romance novels. This narrative has been said throughout time. So I love that you're taking sort of this romantic notion that people could wake up and know that somebody had been there that whole time, but actually relating it to what we know in science today, and hopefully we'll be able to prove in years to come. Amazing.
Yeah, we kind of split the brain into emotional and kind of thinking. I think that's kind of like a dichotomy that a lot of people are familiar with, and that actually bears out in the different structures in the brain. Not everything should be measured, and not everything, can be measured. But I think that sort of notion that our thinking brains are oftentimes trying to keep our emotional brains happy. We lead with emotion and then try to justify it with logic. Things like coma patients responding to loved ones. I mean, I think that's something that's off limits in terms of, science, but that's also why we need fiction and novels to kind of dive into that. So
That's amazing. And I could geek out about this all day. I'm learning so much. Thank you so much. Okay. you're a practicing neurologist. You also are now the president-elect of the Colorado Medical Society. You volunteer in lots of different places. You like to say, if you want something to get done, give it to a busy person because they'll get it done faster than it's not busy. How did you get this done? How did you get the writing done, even though you're doing
Um,
all these other things? How did that go?
yeah. So I do think about this too. And I think it does just come back to passion. And if you love something like I love writing and literature, you'll find a way. I've written at all times of the day throughout the last 10 years. I've written at night. I've kind of become a morning person. I've written through different schedules, like Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. The schedule that I have now actually lends itself fairly decently. When I'm busy and I'm taking hospital calls, sometimes it's 24 hours and I was up at 1 a.m. yesterday and didn't get back to, I have definite, stress when I'm taking call, but then I also get a certain amount of days off every month where I can wake up and try to get 500, 1,000 words in. I just did that this morning on the third part of the trilogy, which I just started about a month ago. And so I think it's just sort of one of those, like you find a way. This particular novel, Stage of Fools, was actually a pandemic project, which I think there were certain advantages to, pandemic writing. I think I wrote 3 of the 9 manuscripts in that 18, 24-month
Wow.
time frame. Oh yeah, and Stage of Fools was the third one that I finished at like New Year's Eve on 2021, 2022.
And I could see, I mean, certainly in the medical profession, I'm sure that your experience was very different from many of ours during the pandemic when we spent a lot of time alone, but many people were. And so this kind of soliloquy and comatose patient who spends a lot of time on his own, I could see that during the pandemic being inspired to write that.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes, reality, fiction mirrors reality and vice versa. But yeah, I think that you're absolutely very insightful and right about that, it's very much a pandemic inspired project.
Without screaming pandemic. And people often ask me that nowadays, should I write about the pandemic? Should I put it in there? And the truth is most of us don't want to read about the actual pandemic, but the themes and how we changed as humans and as people throughout that, certainly anything that reflects that, I think is really, really timely and interesting. Okay. I am fascinated by brain science, or what I call brain science. It's probably not really real brain science when we talk about it, but I'm just absolutely obsessed with understanding how readers respond. Why do we read? How does that work? And how we can use our writing to interact with our readers' brains. And it's something that I just am always looking for those connections. Can you talk a little about what's possible right now in the field of interpreting what's going on in people's brains, whether it's reading or anything else, and what's coming? Because I know there's, right now we can interpret brain waves, it sounds like, and signals to know when we're going to make certain facial expressions, for example. So what are we studying? What's out there right now?
Yeah, and so that's a great question. And thankfully, there's a lot to unpack there as well in terms of what's been studied and what could come. And so I think that, probably a good place to start would just be that I think that we don't know and we may never know why human brains are so deeply, intuitively, foundationally geared for story, but we are. And, maybe it came from, ancient times when people were sitting around the campfire trying to pass time. I think we can speculate. There's also probably a survival advantage to like, hey, I heard this story about, this thing over there where there's, a predator and I shouldn't go over there, kind of like the communication, and how that's built out into story. And so that we know that we're hardwired for that. There's no question about that. And it crosses disciplines too. I think language, music is a language, math is a language, everything is language on some level. So everything's kind of telling a story, but to your point, engaging different parts of our brains. And so I think a good way to kind of split that up would be to talk about the difference between, being told a story and reading a story. Reading is a fairly modern or new, let's say newer technology. I think the first novels came around, maybe 400 years ago. And we're talking about in the broader context of human history, but, audio has been around forever. I mean, everybody, talks about Homer traveling around. And if there was a Homer, it was kind of like story time, back in the day. But these two things are obviously beautifully, have grown together. And the interesting thing about the research into storytelling is that we've learned that regardless of whether you're reading or listening, the same areas of the brain are activated. And so, the memory centers, the emotional centers, how we create meaning is essentially identical whether you're receiving the information visually or auditory, which I think
So
is fascinating.
so when people fight over whether listening to audiobooks is considered reading, it's kind of, there's an elitist group in there. And I listen to lots of audiobooks. I'm an editor. I read manuscripts on a screen all day. And honestly, the last thing I want to do at the end of the day is open up a book and read because my eyes are tired. I'm old. But yeah, so I consume a lot of story that way. And I did hear that brainwaves have been studied, that they're similar. And then I was like, all right. And I think I've also heard said that your brain actually goes through a lot of the same motions as if you were in the story, right? As if you were really experiencing.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. I mean, you're not missing out by listening when it comes to, meaning and this kind of semantic. I mean, it's really a sensory difference. It's not a semantic difference. Visual versus auditory. You're able to grasp the same meaning. Absolutely, to your point. I mean, I think even, beyond people who read all day and maybe don't want to read at the end of the day, you have people who have things like dyslexia and have a hard time, looking at stuff on the page. And so I think it's good news for everyone that audiobooks, imply the same meaning. Maybe just a few caveats to that, not big ones, but just kind of like, attentionally, when, you're listening, it's kind of like you got to be there. You can't stop and skim around. And so just kind of looking into this a little bit further, I found that probably the ideal situation to listen to an audiobook is when you're walking, because just a little bit of stimulation actually enhances that auditory process. And so, but basically, yeah, I mean, I'm very much like you. I'm in the same camp of any which way and any way you slice it. Audiobooks are
In
great.
that story, right? Like you said, our brains are wired for story, and I love to consume story. And people ask me about my hobbies, and sometimes I'm like, I like Netflix, right? And I'm okay with that because it's consuming story. And as a book coach, I need to be always looking at story and how does it work at all things. And Netflix really does it. It can make you sit there. I saw a meme recently. It was just like executives asking, would you like to watch a 10-hour movie? And us saying, no, absolutely not. We don't want to watch a 10-hour movie. Okay, well, I'll break it down into 45-minute increments and you can sit for 10 hours and binge watch them. We're like, yeah, let's do that. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but we'd be remiss not to mention Lisa Cron's Wired for Story and the research that's in those books. I don't know, you use some of the terminology, so I don't know if you've read them, but great book series for writers. Story Genius is one of my go-tos when we're talking about story structure, and it kind of dabbles into that brain science on it, and it's what got me really, really interested back in the day, many years ago now,
Yeah. I
about
think that these
how it
things,
affects.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that these things, like, we're writers, like we know this, like whatever, how you unpack the word knowledge, but we know this intuitively, but it's great to have the brain science to back it up. Maybe just to expand to your second question, about what's going on in the brain and what kind of architecture and how things are received. I'm actually a big advocate of this notion that we shouldn't, just because we can't describe it scientifically, that we should discount some of these effects of artistic practice in the humanities. I actually sponsored a scholarship at my alma mater, the University of Kansas, where I met Steve Parker and the Nabokov guy, who, but kind of justifying that with this notion that the benefits, while not, you can sit down and have a brain scan, there are things that have been studied, a term that you may be familiar with called attributional complexity. Attributional complexity. And I did some research when I was doing the scholarship because I really wanted it to be, and I should mention the scholarship is.
I was going to say, you give me too much credit. I'm not familiar with that term, but I'm excited to learn. Keep going.
Yeah,
Scholarship.
and
Yes.
yeah, and it may be buried somewhere, like, and the tech companies don't want you to know, but basically, yeah, the scholarship is for students who want to major in English and go to medical school or practice in the healthcare professions broadly. It could be medical school, it could be physical therapy, it could be nursing. But this notion of empathy and how we have these cells in our brains that we call mirror cells. And those are essentially the empathy cells. Like when somebody is smiling or somebody is having a hard time, like you actually activate those cells in your brain so that you actually feel what that person is feeling. And I think that we intuitively kind of sense that we have these in different gradations and different amounts in different people. And some people kind of are further on the spectrum, some people are not. But the justification for the scholarship was like, hey, we know that patient outcomes are better if they felt like they were listened to and they were empathized with, and reading builds that empathy. And then even further than that, this thing called attributional complexity, which kind of builds off of these empathy cells and this kind of concept, that if you read fiction, you're constantly perspective taking. You're constantly in the perspective of this character or that character. You're watching how they interact. That doesn't go away when we take that into our daily lives. And so when you ask about like, why are English majors, successful? It's kind of like one of those things that, we may not always be conscious of, but really does bear itself out over the long term. The effects of empathy and attributional complexity in terms of navigating the world and just having that kind of richer human experience. And, to me, that's one definition of success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that speaks to me on so many levels. And I'm really interested and thank you for diving into it. I know you're like, is this enough? Like, is this too much detail? No, I think that the listeners are going to be really interested in this too, because anybody who works with me, we talk about these things a lot. But I think as well, it's how I landed in the arts. Working in the business world, there is very little room for empathy. And eventually it became really obvious, right? Working on Wall Street and then managing factories in China. I mean, I did some big things and big moves in terms of that. And eventually I was just way more interested in helping people tell their stories. And doing that was just more rather than making widgets or making people more money. It just wasn't exciting to me anymore. And that empathy piece of it, I think whatever those cells are, I have way too many in my brain. Yeah. So we know a little bit about those brain waves and how that creates your facial expressions or how you express emotions. Do you think okay, this is one of the tenets of Show Don't Tell, right? We're on the Show Don't Tell writing podcast. I always have to bring it back. So do you think that gave you an advantage when one of the tenets is don't name emotions, show them and how they work? Has your work with patients on how those emotions are actually expressed, does that actually help you come up with some original ideas when you're expressing emotions on the page, or is it unrelated?
Yeah, so I definitely think that what I do as a physician, as a neurologist, and what I do as an author, and a lot of people have talked about this before. There's a long tradition of physicians who write, and I think that there may be a good reason for that, and that everything with patients is story. That's the first thing you do when you meet a patient is you try to, get the story, take a history. It's a narrative about the long kind of arc that happens to a person's body or their mind. And so really what all good physicians should be are good story takers. But then I think that what that kind of builds into, or what certainly has happened to me and I think helps me, is that I sort of have a natural inclination, but to take storytelling and then to expand on that and try to get into a lot of things you're talking about with different kind of emotional processes, and then to really, have some kind of movement. Like I know in the hospital, like nobody who's talking to me is having a good day.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be in the hospital. It's uncomfortable. You can't sleep. There are alarms going off. You're worried about what's going on, what's going to happen to you. I mean, everybody is kind of in this state of kind of quasi shock. They're out of their element, but in case anything happens, or to kind of get set on that right path. And so I don't, take any of my patients' stories or experiences and directly translate them, into a fictional account.
No, and
But
nor could you ethically, and nor should you, right? But they're all going to be. We always write a little bit about what we know. It's going to be informed by that and a compilation of human experiences, right?
yeah, and that's case in point, Stage of Fools. It's not based on any one character or any one patient or any one experience that I had, but really this collection of experiences, getting asked what's going on to a person in a coma and what's going to happen and what could happen.
Yeah. So that's what exists today in terms of being able to interpret brain waves and do some basics, right? And I read also like what's coming, because I read there's something about, we could feed all those brainwave activity into AI and match that to possible thoughts and actions, and you're involved in the privacy of it. And I was like, wow, this is some big stuff that's coming. What should we be worried about? What is the possibility? And I think in somewhere you said within the next 5 years, some of this might be real, right? What's coming in terms of the technology that's out there today?
Thank you for asking that. And, it's kind of surreal. I think sometimes I think the things in our lives, they kind of choose us, and you sort of look back and try to connect the dots. But actually at the same time I was writing Stage of Fools, I reached out to a foundation based at Columbia University in New York and in Washington, DC, called the Neuroscience Foundation. And they're a foundation for the promotion of innovation and for the development of the safe and ethical uses of neurotechnology, kind of broadly, generally speaking. And going back to that kind of 10-year runway, where the thing that happened 10 years ago is there was a funding initiative signed by the president to fund neurotechnology research and applications, and just really try to dive into the brain and understand it better using technology. And so that was the same year that I had the idea for Stage of Fools and actually wrote it. I was reaching out to them. I hadn't connected with them yet, but then reached out again, and they got in touch and said, yeah, we would like to maybe think about doing some work in Colorado and see what we could do on this issue of mental privacy. There are 5 kind of broad categories of ethical issues with neurotechnology. But the one that's really here today, to your point, is this issue of mental privacy. And so fast forward about a year and a half after I reached out to them, we had the first bill actually in the world for the protection of these brainwaves, this neural data, so that, you or I'm actually wearing a pair of headphones right now that are collecting my brainwaves through these sensors. I don't know.
Very cool. I mean, I can see for those listening, we do this on video and then we don't share the video with you. But yeah, Sean's wearing headphones and I had no idea that they were collecting his brainwaves. I'll be interested to see if you get any interesting data on what happened when and whether it was
Yeah,
interesting or not.
yeah, yeah,
Very cool.
yeah. Yeah, no, but just to your point, I mean, this stuff is here today. You can buy brainwave sensing, headphones. And I know that I'm kind of like a biased kind of early adopter as a neurologist, but I mean, it's here. You can get it off Amazon. You could go to the website and have these headphones. And what they're doing, they are tracking my focus right now. And I can actually see I'm in high focus right now. No
Keeping
surprise.
you on your toes, keeping you on your toes. It's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the danger? I mean, is it possible that if I fall into a coma and you put some kind of headphones on me in 5 years, you might be able to see my thoughts? And is that the danger? Is that what we're worried about? And obviously, I wouldn't be able. Maybe you could ask me, and then I'd be able to consent, and that might be a different story. But where are we going with this? Like, as we talk about AI, and I have this conversation daily with writers, people are on all over the spectrum. Some people are not really that worried about AI, and some people are like really worried about AI and really think that it's going to be the downfall of literature and the world. So, what is the danger here with brainwave data privacy?
Yeah, and that's an amazingly wonderful question. And the answer is that it's not so much that we're worried about AI today, like reading whatever thoughts are coming out of your brain. Like these headphones can track my focus by tracking different frequencies of brain waves, but they're not going to be able to translate my words. But the caveat there is that the answer is not yet. Last year in a laboratory in Australia, they were able to prove and show that with a headset, just something similar to what I'm wearing right now, you could decode the actual words in a person's mind with about 40% fidelity. You imagine how quickly, technology progresses, and the algorithms, and the more data you get, the more data you capture, the more reliable and the more, fidelity you get from your insights. And so this stuff is coming. It's going to be wonderful, for patients. And I'm a big advocate of this stuff too. But, to your point, like,
Yeah, a big but there. Scary,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so in terms of like mind reading and like, let's say, just create a hypothetical situation where in the future, the government wants to know what's going on, in your mind, and, you don't have the right to refuse, and they put a head cap on you, or, it could lead to interrogation. It could lead to manipulation. It's just, if the company knows sort of your level of alertness, your level of focus, that could be used for those types of purposes, or it could be sold to an insurance company. You can give away a lot of your health data from this information. You mentioned what mood you're in. You can tell not just things like epilepsy, but things like OCD, schizophrenia, anxiety,
Yeah.
depression, all these things, dementia, so people should just have a right. Technology is fundamentally neutral. When you think about, like nuclear technology, you can power a city, you can do, destructive things with it. Genetic technology, you can tell somebody about their health. You can clone people, and that's weird. So we're just trying to steer things towards only the good applications. And we think that people ought to have fair access to all the good applications. At the same time, that you should have rights to, use your data, request its deletion, request that it not be used for certain purposes. When you look at what happened with 23andMe, with that, all that data being sold to pharmaceutical companies, like we just want to be sure that consumers have a right to their brains, which it's hard to argue against. But that's why we were able to get the first laws passed in the country, in the world last year for neural data protection, part of the Colorado, California, now Montana and Connecticut Privacy Acts. We're working at the federal level and at the global level. So just trying to get, some momentum so that, you can wear these headphones and not have to worry.
I love, love, love that you are on the bleeding edge of the technology that we don't even, most of us have never even heard of yet. and you're already protecting us from. And I think that's really amazing. I go to when I go to schools and I speak to students about writing, I often will put up this slide, and it's this picture of two boys with tinfoil hats on, right? And the probes and all the things that you used to see in the 70s and the science fiction, if you will, of what we thought was going to happen. And I say to them, "Oh, I forgot these hats at home, but if I put one on my head and you put one on your head, then I can just think of the story and the movie plays in my mind and it will also play in your mind. And then I don't have to write." And for these kids, they're amazing. I love it. And they all say, "You would have those? You would have those, Susie?" And I say, "No, no, actually, I'm lying. And that's okay because I'm a fiction writer. It's what I do for a living." Right. And then you get a laugh. But they really believe in it. And it sounds like that kind of thing is coming. But I think we're still going to need that translation. I mean, that's a one-to-one. And how do we get that back into readers' minds? You still have to create it. Yeah, there's so many applications. I could talk about this all day long. Thank you so much. I want to just end our podcast time as we wrap up with some quick fire questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. So, how long did it take you to write this debut novel that finally got published? From the time that you thought of it, probably even the time that you started the prequel, until you published it? How long?
Prequel, I started, it was about 10 years. Stage of Fools, the writing was 4 months, but the idea about 8 months, but the prequel about 10 years from.
I actually love that you wrote it in 4 months. And because that much planning and thinking, because I like to say that it's not just, I mean, we're talking about brains here today, but you carried that story around and you kind of worked on it. And so when you sat down to write, it was there. And I find that with busy professionals, and it was me as well when I was a business executive and I would write, I would block a weekend and then I would binge write and get 10,000 words a day or something. And I hate even saying that because I don't want people to compare. Because what happened was when I quit my job to do all things writing, I thought I could do that whenever I wanted. And the answer was I couldn't. I couldn't sit down every single day and get that kind of result because I needed that thinking time, right? So there's this marination time so I love that, 10 years for the storyline, but then when you actually mapped it out and sat down and did it, it was there. So
Yeah,
it all has to.
yeah, yeah, I have a long runway, but yeah, I think it's a good kind of buffer against writer's block too, in that if you've planned and you kind of know the main points. I don't like to know everything, but
Yeah.
if you basically know where you're headed, it's harder to get
Yeah.
stopped
Oh,
and
writer's block
blocked.
is a whole different episode. We could have that one too, because there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons, and a lot of it is exactly what you just said. It's you haven't decided what's going to happen, and so you can't write it. Okay. Number two, what was your first big break where you knew that this novel was actually going to happen? You've written 9 manuscripts. How did you know that this was the one that was going to see the light of day? What was your break?
I think that it was when the publisher reached out to me and said, "Can we publish this?" I didn't particularly, I mean, to our previous question, I'd invested a lot more time and a lot more energy and effort into writing the first several manuscripts. And this one was kind of the shortest from start to finish. But I guess maybe I learned something by that point because, I was, working with them on some editing services, and they read it and said, "Hey, we're doing this, and can we publish it?" So that was kind of the moment.
Oh, amazing. And what's your best advice for writers just starting out listening to this podcast? What do you wish you'd known when you started this journey 9 manuscripts ago?
I would just say, I think it's sort of like the marathon sprint thing. I always want people to have success, wonderful success with their first project. But these things, they can take a long time. I mean, they do take a long time, even from the publishing agreement on this novel. It was still a 2-year time frame. So I would urge, number one, passion, obsession, really get into your work and just when you're doing it, care about nothing else. But then also on the flip side, just be open to the idea that, careers are built over years and years. And so just not to get discouraged, I guess is what I'm getting at, that it doesn't happen like in the moment, that it's never going to happen.
Yeah, publishing has been a really eye-opening experience coming from the world of tech and manufacturing and business. And publishing moves a lot slower, and there's a lot of patience required. And sometimes that's awesome, and sometimes it can be really frustrating, but it is normal. So, where can we find you and your book?
Yeah, so you can find it on all the major platforms. You can find it at Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. You can find it from the publisher, highfrequencypress.com. I got a personal website, seanpozowski.com. There will be an audiobook out here.
We'll put all the links. So by the time this show comes out, you should be able to get the audiobook. And right from the doctor's mouth that listening to the book is just as effective and does the same things in your brain as reading. So make sure you go grab those. Thank you so much, Dr. Pozowski, for coming on the show. It has been my absolute pleasure and honor to geek out about brain science. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, likewise, Susie. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Show Don't Tell Writing Podcast with me, Susie Vidori. It is my absolute honor to bring you the straight goods for that book you're writing or the book that you're planning to write. Please help me keep the podcast going by helping people find us. You can subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you're listening to show how much you enjoy the show. That's how other listeners will find us. Also, visit susievidori.com/newsletter to hop on my weekly inspired writing newsletter list, where you'll stay inspired and be the first to know about all the upcoming training events and writing courses that happen in my community. Want my eyes on your writing? Submit a page of your current draft for a chance to come on the podcast at the link in the show notes. I'd love to chat with you about your writing in my always positive, incredibly supportive way, so that you can make great strides towards your writing goals. I'm here to cheer you on. Remember, that book you're writing is going to open doors that you haven't even thought of yet, and I can't wait to help you make it the absolute best it can be. See you again right here next week.